In the fall of 1798, 17 travelers vanished along a 20-mile stretch of the Wilderness Road in southeastern Kentucky. They left no trace, just abandoned horses and scattered belongings, silent witnesses to a mystery that would haunt the region for centuries. What makes these disappearances so terrifying isn't just the number of victims, but the cover-up that followed. Local authorities buried every record of the investigation, hiding the truth for over 200 years. It wasn't until 1987, when a county clerk stumbled upon a cache of sealed court documents, that the dark secret of the Harden family farm came to light. What those papers revealed was almost too horrifying to believe. A killing operation so carefully planned, so perfectly hidden behind a facade of Christian charity, that it ran for 8 years without anyone suspecting a thing. Before we go deeper into the twisted story of the farm that became Kentucky's first true house of horrors, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. We're about to uncover secrets that powerful families wanted buried forever. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from you. This nightmare began not with screams in the night, but with a simple act of routine paperwork in a dusty courthouse basement. Back in 1798, southeastern Kentucky was a place caught between civilization and wilderness. Thousands of settlers poured westward, chasing the promise of land and prosperity. The Wilderness Road, cut through the Cumberland Gap by Daniel Boone just 2 decades earlier, was the main route. It was a narrow, dangerous trail more than 200 miles long, where one wrong step could mean death, whether from exposure, wild animals, or the many human predators lurking along the path. Small frontier towns sprang up along the road like wildflowers after rain. They were places of refuge where weary travelers could rest, resupply, and gather the latest news about dangers ahead. The survival of these settlements depended on their ability to keep travelers safe. One such settlement was Millfield, a tiny town of barely 300 souls, perched where the road descended from rocky ridges into the fertile valley of Beaver Creek. In Millfield, everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. Founded in 1794 by a group of Virginia Baptists seeking religious freedom, the town's faith shaped every part of daily life. Sunday services were mandatory, and strict moral codes governed everything from drinking to dancing. At the heart of Millfield stood Hendrick's General Store, a weathered log building that served as trading post, town hall, and courthouse all in one. Its owner, Jeremiah Hendricks, a gruff ex-militiaman who had fought beside Daniel Boone, ran the store with an iron fist and an eye for profit. His shelves carried everything a traveler could need: gunpowder, salt, whiskey, blankets, and the latest news from the world beyond the mountains. Nearby stood the Cumberland Inn, the pride of the frontier, run by Martha Crane, a widowed innkeeper from Philadelphia. Her inn offered hot meals, clean beds, and something just as valuable: conversation that reminded travelers of the world they had left behind. Millfield's spiritual heart was a New Jerusalem Baptist Church, a simple log building big enough to hold a whole town on Sundays. Its pastor, Reverend Ephraim Cole, was a Harvard-educated minister who left Boston to bring faith to the frontier. His sermons mixed scripture with practical survival lessons, earning him the respect of settlers who might otherwise have just kept moving west. Among the town's most admired residents were the Hardens: Ezekiel, his wife Temperance, and their 3 grown children, Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy. They arrived in 1791, claiming to be refugees from brutal Indian raids in eastern Virginia. The family quickly became pillars of the community, Ezekiel preaching alongside Reverend Cole, Temperance organizing charity for struggling settlers. Ezekiel Harden was a giant of a man, over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a voice that filled the church without effort. His sermons stirred listeners to tears, describing divine love one moment and eternal damnation the next. People whispered that he preached as if he had seen heaven and hell with his own eyes. Temperance Harden, though small and frail-looking, was just as influential. Her knowledge of medicine and healing herbs was legendary. She treated everything from broken bones to childbirth complications, often racing through the night to reach sick neighbors in time. Some said her skills bordered on miraculous. Their children seemed the very image of frontier virtue. Caleb, the eldest at 26, had his father's strength and his mother's kindness, working tirelessly on a farm and helping neighbors in need. Josiah, 2 years younger, was smaller and quieter, often teaching the town's children through the harsh winter months. When farm work slowed, Josiah often taught the town's children during the long, cold winters. Their sister, Mercy, was just 22 and considered one of the most beautiful young women in the county. Her kindness and gentle nature made her loved by everyone, both men and women alike. The Harden farm itself was impressive, 400 acres of rich bottomland along Beaver Creek, just 3 miles south of town. Buying the land had nearly bankrupted Ezekiel, but it turned out to be the best decision of his life. The soil produced bumper crops of corn and tobacco. The creek watered livestock and powered a small grist mill that served the surrounding settlements. Visitors often remarked on the farm's prosperity. The Hardens seemed to have more wealth than simple farming could explain. Their homestead was no ordinary log cabin. It was a 2-story house with stone chimneys and glass windows, a rare luxury on the frontier. Inside, the rooms were furnished with carved chairs, imported china, silver candlesticks, and shelves of books that spoke of education and refinement. The barn was massive. It would hold 50 horses, and the outbuildings formed a small complex: smokehouse, dairy, blacksmith shop, and what Ezekiel boasted was the largest root cellar in the entire county. But what truly made the Hardens stand out was their hospitality. The frontier was a harsh place, and travelers were constantly in danger. It was common for strangers to arrive at the Harden farm and need help, and Ezekiel never turned them away. He had been known to ride out during storms to rescue broken wagons or injure horses, often bringing entire families back to his home to wait out the weather. Temperance Harden's reputation only strengthened their standing. Her medical skills saved countless lives, and she treated everyone, whether they could pay or not. Her infirmary was better stocked than most frontier doctors could ever dream of, complete with surgical instruments and rare medicines. By 1798, travelers planned their journeys around the Harden farm. Local guides directed people toward Beaver Creek, promising fair prices, good food, and safe shelter. Mercy even kept a guest book, carefully recording the hundreds of merchants, preachers, families, and adventurers who stayed there over the years. But on the frontier, appearances could be dangerously deceiving. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on October 13, 1798. A merchant named Samuel Fletcher failed to arrive in Lexington as scheduled. Fletcher was no ordinary traveler. He was one of the most reliable merchants on the Wilderness Road. For 12 years, he had made the dangerous journey between Virginia and Kentucky 4 times a year, always on time. In a world where being late could mean losing everything, his punctuality was legendary. When his business partner, Thomas Greeley, received no word from Fletcher for 5 days, 2 days beyond his scheduled arrival, he knew something was seriously wrong. Greeley set out at dawn on October 18th, retracing Fletcher's route from Lexington. He questioned innkeepers, farmers, and traders along the road. All of them confirmed Fletcher had passed through on time. The trail was clear until he reached Millfield. There, Fletcher simply vanished. The first real clue came at noon on the second day of searching. Fletcher's distinctive bay mare was found grazing near Miller's Creek. The horse was calm, unharmed, and still saddled, yet its bridle had been carefully removed and hung on a low tree branch. Someone had deliberately released it. Even stranger, Fletcher's saddlebags were untouched, still holding his trading goods and nearly $50 in silver, a fortune on the frontier. Robbery, the most common cause of disappearance, could be ruled out. But what truly chilled Greeley was a trail of personal belongings, dropped one by one, leading away from the road and into the dark woods, as if Fletcher had been dragged, forced to leave a breadcrumb trail behind. Local Constable Jacob Winters took the case personally. Winters was no ordinary lawman. He was a veteran of the Continental Army, a man who had seen death up close and knew how to track killers. Within hours, he had gathered a search party of 12 men, including Henrik Johansson, a Swedish tracker with near-legendary skill, and Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter who knew every hideout within 50 miles. Their search led them straight toward the Harden farm. The evidence was unmistakable. Torn fabric snagged on thorns, droplets of blood, clear signs that Fletcher had been alive, though injured, when he left the road. It appeared he had been struggling, fighting against whoever was forcing him deeper into the forest. But then, at the exact boundary of the Harden property, the trail ended completely. The searchers combed every inch of the ground, certain they had missed something. But it was as if Samuel Fletcher had stepped off the face of the earth the moment he crossed onto the Harden land. The search party scoured the edge of the Harden property until nightfall, desperate for any clue. But there was nothing. No disturbed earth, no blood, no tracks. It was as if Samuel Fletcher had been lifted from the ground by invisible hands and carried away into thin air. Even Henrik Johansson, the legendary tracker, admitted defeat. When Constable Winters questioned Ezekiel Harden, the patriarch was calm, helpful, and just a little too perfect. He confirmed that Fletcher had stopped at the farm on October 13th, arriving just before sunset. The merchant had asked about a shortcut that would save him a day's travel to Lexington. Ezekiel said he had warned Fletcher against taking unknown trails, especially with valuable goods and winter coming on. But Fletcher had been nervous, distracted, constantly checking his saddlebags and glancing over his shoulder as though he were being followed. He mentioned strange men shadowing him since leaving Virginia, but refused Ezekiel's offer to wait for an escort. He declined Temperance's hot meal, rejected Mercy's offer of a clean bed, and even turned down Caleb's offer to guide him safely to the Ridge Trail. As the Hardens told it, Fletcher simply rode north into the darkening hills and vanished from their lives. Every member of the family told the same story. Every detail matched. Every word was identical. And that was exactly what troubled Winters. In his experience, real witnesses never told the exact same story. They argued over small points, disagreed on what someone said or did, even contradicted one another about timing. But the Hardens' account was flawless. Too flawless. Winter's suspicion grew as he toured the farm. Since his last visit, the property had changed in unsettling ways. A massive new smokehouse had been built, far larger than any family would reasonably need. Its thick stone walls almost fortress-like. Freshly turned earth surrounded several outbuildings, as if major digging projects had recently been completed. Most disturbing of all was the root cellar. It had been expanded, its new timber supports forming an entrance wide enough to fit a wagon. When Winters asked about the improvements, Ezekiel smiled and explained that the family had enjoyed a prosperous harvest and were preparing to sell their goods in Lexington. The explanation made sense, but something in Ezekiel's measured tone set Winters on edge. The Hardens' famed hospitality felt different this time. Temperance's hand shook as she served coffee. Mercy kept glancing at her father, as though silently asking permission to speak. Even Caleb and Josiah, usually cheerful, stood in stiff silence, their eyes watchful. Winters left the farm uneasy, but with no evidence he could act on. Fletcher's disappearance was officially recorded as a highway robbery or Indian attack. Just another tragedy on the dangerous road west. His horse was sold at auction to cover debts, and within a month, Samuel Fletcher's name faded into memory. But his disappearance was only the beginning. Through the winter of 1798 and into the spring of 1799, the vanishings continued, one every 2 or 3 weeks like clockwork. And this time, the victims were not just lone merchants. Entire families disappeared. Traveling parties with armed guards disappeared. Each was last seen heading toward or asking about the Harden farm. The fear was contagious. People whispered warnings along the road, and parents kept their children close after dark. Millfield, once a beacon of safety, was becoming a place travelers feared to pass through. In November, the disappearances claimed Dr. Marcus Cromwell, a respected physician on his way to open a practice in Louisville. Cromwell had been carrying medical instruments worth over $300, his entire life's work. His wagon was found overturned near Devil's Fork, only 3 miles from a Harden farm. At first, authorities believed it was an accident. Perhaps he'd been thrown from his seat and wandered off, lost in the forest, eventually succumbing to the cold. But when searchers examined the wreck, they noticed something strange. Cromwell's medical bag, containing surgical instruments, including a bone saw and amputation kit, was missing. No animal could have taken it. No ordinary thief would have left the coins and goods untouched. Someone had taken that bag on purpose. The scattered belongings at the crash site made no sense. Nothing of value had been taken. Then came December, and the Henley family simply vanished. Jonathan Henley, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 small children had been caught in one of the worst blizzards anyone could remember. Their wagon was found just half a mile from the Harden farm, stuck in a snowdrift. Ezekiel Harden claimed they never reached his property, likely lost to the storm. But when the weather cleared, searchers found something chilling. The wagon had been freed from the snow, moved aside of the road, and thoroughly searched. The family's clothing and personal items were gone, but their tools and food supplies were left untouched. Even stranger, the tracks around the wagon showed that several people had worked together to pull it free, spending valuable time in deadly weather. Then, in January, Reverend Nathan Cross disappeared. He was a circuit preacher known across the region, famous for traveling fearless and alone through dangerous territory. He'd survived bandit attacks, Indian raids, even wild animals, but now he was simply gone. His horse was found 3 days later, saddlebags still carrying nearly $200 in church donations. Whatever happened to him, it wasn't a robbery. Each case followed the same eerie pattern: abandoned horses, personal effects scattered as if dropped mid-struggle, and tracks that always seemed to lead in the direction of the Harden property, before vanishing completely. Whenever questioned, the Hardens gave calm, plausible answers. They admitted to seeing some of the victims, but only briefly, always warning them of dangers ahead. Their story never wavered, and that was exactly what unsettled Constable Winters the most. Real witnesses contradict each other on small details, but the Hardens told the same perfect version of events every time, like a script. Yet Winters was trapped. The Hardens were pillars of the community. Ezekiel's sermons drew crowds from miles away. Temperance was praised as a healer, almost saint-like after saving dozens during a fever outbreak. To accuse them without proof would ruin Winters' career, maybe even his life. Then, the first Raol crack appeared, from an unlikely source. 9-year-old Timothy Voren, a curious boy from a nearby homestead, told Winters something terrifying. He claimed that on several nights that winter, while exploring near Beaver Creek, he had heard screaming coming from the direction of the Harden farm. Not the kind of screams you hear from a farm accident or even childbirth, but long, desperate, blood-freezing screams of someone in unbearable pain. Sometimes there were other sounds too: hammering, ropes creaking, and even voices chanting in unison. Each time, the noise would go on for hours and then stop. Silence, as if nothing had ever happened. Timothy's parents admitted they'd heard strange noises too, but they dismissed them as wild animals or the wind. After all, who would ever suspect the Hardens? Good Christian folk don't scream in the night. That was the thought that haunted Constable Winters as he listened to young Timothy's story. The boy could even name the dates he heard the screams, and they matched, almost exactly, the days when travelers had gone missing. That was no coincidence. Quietly, Winters began to build his case. Carefully, patiently, knowing that accusing the Hardens without irrefutable proof could destroy him. He interviewed neighbors one by one, asking cautious questions that wouldn't raise alarm. The picture that emerged chilled him to the bone. Sarah Mitchell, who lived closest to the farm, recalled nights where lanterns moved between the Harden buildings long after everyone should have been asleep. She'd heard digging, heavy, relentless digging. That went on until dawn. When she had mentioned it to Temperance after church, the woman smiled kindly, and explained that the family was expanding their root cellar, working at night to save daylight for farming. At the time, Sarah believed her, but months of nightly activity? That was no root cellar. And Sarah realized she'd never seen any of the huge piles of earth that such a project should have produced. Even more troubling was what Henrik Johansson found near the fence line of his farm. The old Swede was a master tracker, a man who could read the forest like a book, and what he discovered was horrifying. Bones. Not just the remains of butchered livestock, but bones that had been cracked, split, and sawed apart with tools. Horse bones, pig bones, cattle skulls, and among them, fragments he couldn't identify at all. Some of the bones had been boiled. Some bore deep cut marks as though carefully processed. This wasn't the work of scavengers. It was deliberate. When Henrik questioned Ezekiel about it, the patriarch explained it away easily. They'd had to dispose of diseased animals, scattering the remains to keep predators from the farm. But Henrik knew better. The bones were too clean, too precise, too organized to be left to nature. And it wasn't just physical evidence. The Hardens themselves were changing. The once friendly children had grown silent and watchful. Caleb and Josiah, once the pride of the community, now seemed tense and distracted in public, their eyes always darting as though expecting danger. Mercy Harden's transformation was the most shocking. Once beautiful and full of life, she now looked pale and haunted, avoiding people and shrinking away from conversation. Even Ezekiel's sermons had shifted. The man who once preached love and mercy now spoke of fire, judgment, and the cleansing of evil. His words were filled with violence, and his followers seemed enthralled. Digging deeper, Winters discovered there was something even stranger about the Hardens. Their past. The family claimed to have fled Virginia after a brutal Indian raid. But Winters could find no record of such a raid, no mention of any Harden family living there. It was as if they had simply appeared one spring day in 1791, fully formed, with money, livestock, and household goods, and a story no one could verify. For a family who claimed to have lost everything, they had arrived in Kentucky surprisingly well prepared. And just as Winters began to piece it all together, his investigation took an alarming turn. Everything changed in April 1799. A traveling peddler named Isaac Brewster came to Millfield, and with him came the final piece of the puzzle. Brewster was a man who knew everything and everyone across the frontier. As he sat by Winters' fire, he told a story that made the constable's blood run cold. That past winter, Brewster had been in eastern Tennessee, where locals still whisper about a dark chapter of their own history. Between 1789 and 1791, at least 15 travelers had vanished along a lonely stretch of road near a prosperous farm owned by a family named Harper, Zachariah and Prudence Harper, and their 3 grown children. The pattern was unmistakable. Just like in Kentucky, travelers were last seen heading toward the Harper property and were never seen again. Horses were found wandering, belongings scattered. The Harpers were suspected but never caught. There was no evidence. Just as in Millfield, Brewster's description of the Harpers chilled Winters to the bone. Zachariah Harper, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and a preacher's voice. Prudence, a skilled healer, small and sharp-eyed. Their children? They matched Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy Harden so closely it was as though he were describing them directly. And then came the detail that sealed Winters' suspicions. In the spring of 1791, just as suspicion began to focus on them, the Harper family vanished overnight. They burned their own buildings, filled their wells with stones, and fled, leaving behind a ruined farm a mystery that still haunted Tennessee. When investigators searched the land, they found shallow graves hidden throughout the woods, dozens of them. Inside were the remains of travelers and their belongings, proving beyond doubt that the Harpers had been behind the killings. But it was too late. The family was gone, and a 6-month manhunt found nothing. And now, Winters realized they had simply reappeared in Kentucky, with new names, a new farm, and years to perfect their methods. The Hardens weren't just opportunistic killers. They were seasoned predators who had turned murder into a way of life. And judging from the number of disappearances, Kentucky was their most successful hunting ground yet. But still, Winters had no proof that would hold up in court. Suspicion wasn't enough, not against a family as respected as the Hardens. He needed evidence so solid that no judge or jury could ignore it. That evidence came from the last person he expected, Mercy Harden. On the night of May 22nd, 1799, she appeared at Winters' cabin, her face pale, streaked with tears, hands shaking as though she could barely hold herself together. What she told him over the next 3 hours would reveal the full, terrifying truth of what had been happening at the Harden farm, and give Winters what he needed to finally bring the killers to justice. According to Mercy, the family had been murdering travelers for 8 years, beginning just months after their arrival. But it wasn't the number of murders that horrified Winters the most. It was how carefully they had been planned. This was no chaos, no desperate survival. This was ritual. Ezekiel Harden, she said, believed he was carrying out God's will, cleansing the frontier of unworthy souls. The killings weren't random. They were chosen. It began with what the family called the evaluation. When travelers approached the farm, Ezekiel would strike up a friendly conversation, asking about their families, their work, their reason for traveling. What he was really doing was deciding who would live and who would never reach their destination. Isaac Brewster's arrival in Millfield in April 1799 turned growing suspicion into near certainty. Brewster was no ordinary traveler. He was a familiar face across the frontier, a man who spent his life moving between settlements and collecting stories. That winter, he had been in eastern Tennessee, where he heard unsettling rumors about a string of disappearances that haunted the Holston River Valley between 1789 and 1791. At least 15 travelers had vanished along a lonely stretch of road near a prosperous farm run by the Harper family. Zachariah Harper, his wife Prudence, and their 3 grown children. The similarities to the current cases in Kentucky were too perfect to ignore. The pattern was the same. Travelers were last seen heading toward the Harper property, and then nothing. Their belongings were found scattered, their horses abandoned, but no bodies were ever recovered. Local authorities had long suspected the Harpers, but never found proof. There was no physical evidence, just as Constable Winters now faced in Kentucky. But what shook Winters the most was Brewster's description of the Harper family. Zachariah was a tall, imposing man with prematurely gray hair and piercing eyes. Prudence was small and delicate, known for her skill with medicinal herbs. Their children matched the descriptions and even the ages of Caleb Josiah and Mercy Harden almost exactly. Even more chilling, the Harpers had vanished overnight in the spring of 1791, just as suspicion began to fall on them. Their farm was found deserted, buildings partly burned, wells filled with rocks, as if someone had tried to erase every trace of their lives. When authorities finally searched the land, they uncovered dozens of shallow graves scattered through the woods, animals and humans alike. Among the remains were personal effects belonging to the missing travelers. By then, the Harpers were gone. A 6-month manhunt turned up nothing. Many believe they either died in the wilderness or escaped into lands beyond the reach of the law. If Brewster was telling the truth, the Harden family were not just local murderers. They were experienced serial killers, moving from region to region, leaving a trail of bodies across multiple states. And now, they had perfected their methods. But Winters still had no hard proof, not enough to convince a court. That proof came from the last person he ever expected, Mercy Harden. On the night of May 22nd, 1799, Mercy appeared at Winters' cabin like a ghost out of the darkness, her face streaked with tears, her hands shaking with terror. For 3 hours, she told him everything, a confession that revealed the full scope of the horrors at the Harden farm. According to Mercy, her family had been murdering travelers for more than 8 years. The killings weren't random, nor were they just for money. They were methodical, almost ritualistic. Ezekiel Harden, the family's patriarch, believed they were carrying out God's will, purging the frontier of unworthy souls. The process always began the same way: evaluation. When a promising target approached, a traveler with goods, money, or skills the family could use, Ezekiel would strike up a friendly conversation. He'd ask about their journey, their business, even their faith. And then he'd pass judgment. The wealthy were guilty of greed. The educated were guilty of pride. Families with children were accused of recklessness. Even preachers could be condemned as heretics. Once Ezekiel gave his verdict, the family acted like a well-trained militia. The doomed traveler would be invited to stay the night, out of kindness, or so it seemed. They would eat a hearty meal, share prayers, and feel safe. But the final drink of the evening contained a carefully crafted blend of herbs, nearly impossible to detect. Within an hour, the guests would feel heavy, drowsy, and slip into sleep. When they woke, they were no longer guests. They were captives, deep underground in a network of tunnels that stretched for hundreds of feet beneath the farm. The largest chamber was Ezekiel's courtroom, complete with a judge's bench carved from stone, iron shackles on the walls, and religious symbols twisted into instruments of terror. Here, each prisoner faced a grotesque trial. The verdict was always guilty. Some captives were kept alive for weeks or even months, forced to work for family, writing sermons, teaching skills, even performing medical training, before being executed. Others were killed immediately, in ways Ezekiel claimed were biblically sanctioned. Hanging for thieves, drowning for the proud, and the worst punishment saved for those Ezekiel considered the most wicked, wealthy merchants, government officials, or anyone who dared to question frontier faith. Mercy's testimony left no doubt. This was one of the largest killing sprees in American history. Each member of the family had a role. Caleb and Josiah captured victims and maintained the tunnels. Mercy kept detailed ledgers of every killing, names, belongings, final words. And Temperance, their sister, perfected the drugging process, acted as a doctor, and even developed ways to torture prisoners without killing them, breaking their will before the end. It was only through Mercy's confession that the truth finally came to light. The Hardens had mastered the art of erasing every trace of their crimes. They never buried bodies on the farm itself. Instead, they dragged them through the cave system, leaving them deep in remote limestone caverns miles away from the homestead. The caves provided perfect conditions for decomposition, and their distance from the farm made discovery nearly impossible. Every belonging of the victims was processed like goods in a trading post. Money, jewelry, weapons, and tools were either kept or sold far away, where no one could connect them to the missing travelers. Less valuable items were deliberately scattered along roads to suggest robberies or Indian raids. Even clothing was sorted, usable pieces kept, anything distinctive destroyed. The family even had a system for the victims' horses, which posed a special risk since they could be recognized. They sold them through shady horse traders in distant counties, making sure the trail led investigators away from Millfield. But perhaps the most chilling part of their plan was how they used charity as a shield. Every sermon Ezekiel preached, every healing Temperance performed, every neighbor they helped build a reputation so spotless that no one dared suspect them. Who could believe that the family who saved lives during epidemics was also systematically murdering travelers? Mercy revealed that the family had been preparing to expand their operations. Ezekiel dreamed of creating multiple courts of divine justice across the frontier, turning murder into an organized campaign to reshape the moral character of the region. But Mercy did not confess out of guilt. She confessed out of fear. Ezekiel's paranoia had reached a fever pitch. He began to suspect anyone who asked too many questions. Isaac Brewster was on his list. So was Constable Winters. And now, Ezekiel believed even Mercy herself might one day face judgment. Her breaking point came when she revealed the most urgent detail of all. There were captives still alive in the underground chambers. A traveling surveyor named William Patterson had been captured 3 days earlier. His trial was scheduled for the following night. But he wasn't alone. The Hardens were also holding Rebecca Foster, a young woman missing for over a week, and Luther Grimby, an elderly preacher who had vanished a month before. This was no longer just murder. It was an industrial operation. People were being held, sorted, and executed on a schedule, as if their lives were nothing more than raw material. Winters realized there was no more time for a careful investigation or legal procedures. If he waited, Patterson, Foster, and Grimby would be dead within hours. But a direct attack on the Harden farm would be nearly suicidal. The family was armed, experienced, and fighting from a stronghold they had been fortifying for years. Winters faced the hardest decision of his career. He could try to arrest them alone, risking his own life and likely alerting them before the captives could be saved. Or he could ride for reinforcements, which would almost certainly doom the prisoners and allow the Hardens to escape, just as they had before. The decision became clear when Winters realized he wouldn't have to fight alone. Henrik Johansson, a Swedish immigrant and former soldier, immediately volunteered. His military training and deep knowledge of the local terrain made him invaluable. Isaac Brewster, driven by guilt for not exposing the Harpers years earlier, offered his help as well. Two more men, Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter, and Daniel Crawford, a veteran of the Indian Wars, joined them. Together, they formed a small rescue party and devised a plan. It would be simple, but dangerous. Under the cover of darkness, just after midnight on May 23rd, they would strike. The goal was to rescue the prisoners first. Capturing the killers alive would be a bonus. If necessary, they were ready to kill every member of the Harden family to stop them from escaping. Mercy provided key intelligence. The underground tunnels had only two entrances, the main root cellar and a hidden escape tunnel that emerged deep in the woods a quarter-mile from the house. The family kept weapons cached at both entrances. Ezekiel had trained his sons well. Their farm was more than a homestead. It was a fortress. He had drilled Caleb and Josiah in defensive tactics, ready to hold off attackers long enough for the family to escape to the cave system. The approach was dangerous. Nearly a mile of open ground stood between Winter's men and the farm. Discovery would mean certain death. But Johansson's tracking skills proved invaluable, leading them through creek beds and tree lines, cloaking their movement until they were close enough to strike. What they found confirmed Mercy's story, and made it even worse. Fresh piles of earth and stone were scattered across the property, proof of ongoing excavation. The stench of lime and decay hung heavy in the air. From a distance, the farmhouse looked warm and peaceful, light glowing in the windows, but beneath the ground came muffled screams, quickly silenced, and the sound of metal striking stone. The Hardens were still at work. At 2 a.m., the raiders moved in. Winters and Johansson headed for the root cellar entrance, while Stokes and Crawford took position near the escape tunnel. Brewster stayed with the horses, rifle in hand, ready to cover them if things went wrong. What looked like a simple root cellar turned out to be a fortified entrance, with multiple firing positions and killing zones designed to stop an attack. But the family's greatest strength, their careful planning, was undone by the one thing they hadn't prepared for: surprise. When Winters and Johansson descended into the tunnels, they found Ezekiel and his sons completely unprepared. The family wasn't guarding their fortress. They were busy preparing their captives for execution. The rescuers freed the prisoners quickly, though what they saw left them shaken. William Patterson was chained in a cell barely big enough to stand in, weak but alive. Rebecca Foster bore scars from Temperance's treatments, signs of torture meant to break her spirit. Luther Grimby was barely conscious, his body and mind destroyed by weeks of captivity. But the prisoners weren't the only discovery. As the rescuers pushed deeper into the tunnels, they uncovered horrors beyond imagination. Bones and clothing fragments lay scattered across chamber after chamber, a charnel house holding nearly a decade of victims. Then they found the ledgers Mercy had described, page after page, listing 67 victims, their belongings, their fates, and even their final words. It was one of the most extensive records of serial murder ever uncovered on the American frontier. And finally, they found Ezekiel's courtroom. The stone bench, the shackles, the twisted religious symbols, and worst of all, a gruesome display of trophies. Scalps, jewelry, weapons, tokens of pride in their crimes. The capture of the Hardens was violent and bloody. Ezekiel launched into a wild sermon about divine judgment, even as gunfire echoed through the tunnels. Caleb and Josiah fought like cornered animals, using their knowledge of the cave system to ambush the rescuers again and again. The battle raged for nearly an hour before the raiders finally gained the upper hand. Above ground, Temperance tried to destroy the evidence by setting fire to the house. Flames raced through the timbers, threatening to collapse the tunnels and trap everyone below. In the end, the surviving Harden surrendered, except Mercy, who was found kneeling in prayer, waiting for justice. She had never turned on her family out of guilt, only out of fear that one day her father would condemn her too. When the smoke cleared, the evidence stunned the entire frontier. The tunnel stretched for nearly 2 miles, filled with the remains of victims whose names would never be known. The Hardens had murdered on an industrial scale, not out of desperation, but out of belief. The case of the Harden family became one of the darkest chapters in early American history, a chilling reminder that true evil can hide behind the face of piety and respectability. The scale of the Hardens' crimes was worse than anyone had imagined. Multiple chambers had been dug out and reinforced, forming an underground labyrinth large enough to hold dozens of prisoners at once. The evidence told a horrifying story, one that stretched beyond the 8 years the family had lived in Kentucky, possibly decades of killings across other territories. Alongside Mercy's meticulous records of 67 victims, investigators found personal effects and bones suggesting the true number was far higher. Even children had not been spared. Tiny shoes, toys, and clothes were recovered, proof that entire families had been murdered. The Henley family, who vanished during a brutal December blizzard, had been kept alive for days before being executed. Their children, just 6 and 8 years old, were murdered only after watching their parents die. The trial began in June of 1799 and lasted nearly a month. Crowds poured into Lexington, filling the courthouse every day. Relatives of the victims, legal scholars, and curious citizens all came to witness history. The testimony was so disturbing that Judge Samuel Whitmore ordered parts of it sealed forever. Ezekiel Harden showed no remorse. Instead, he used the courtroom as his pulpit, preaching fiery sermons about divine judgment and insisting every murder had been commanded by God. According to him, the caves were not prisons but a holy courthouse, and he and his family were chosen to carry out God's justice. Temperance, Caleb, and Josiah tried to claim they had been coerced by Ezekiel's fanaticism, but the evidence told another story. Mercy's ledgers included notations in multiple handwritings, proof that everyone participated. Personal trophies found in each family member's room revealed that the murders had been acts of pride, not survival. Only Mercy expressed real regret. She admitted her fear had driven her to betray her family before they could turn on her. Her testimony helped identify many of the victims and provided crucial details about the family's methods. In exchange, she was spared the noose but sentenced to life in prison. Judge Whitmore's verdict was swift. Ezekiel, Temperance, Caleb, and Josiah were condemned to hang on August 15, 1799, exactly 1 year after the disappearance of Samuel Fletcher first exposed their crimes. On the day of the execution, more than 4,000 people gathered, the largest crowd Kentucky had ever seen. The atmosphere was grim, yet almost carnival-like, as vendors sold food and drinks to the spectators who had come to watch the end of the frontier's most notorious killers. Ezekiel remained defiant to the very end. With the noose around his neck, he cursed the crowd and prophesied that God would punish Kentucky for destroying his chosen servants. Temperance, Caleb, and Josiah went to their deaths silently. Afterward, the Harden farm was burned to the ground, every building reduced to ash. The tunnels were collapsed with explosives, sealing away the dead forever. Authorities declared the land cursed. No one would ever build there again. But the case left a lasting mark on frontier justice. It inspired new laws for land purchases, set protocols for missing persons cases, and forced communities to confront how blind faith could be twisted into something monstrous. The Harden story became a warning that evil can with a mask of piety, and that even the most respected families can hide the darkest of secrets. The Harden case changed everything. Communities across the frontier began to question their neighbors, and even themselves. If a family so respected, so charitable, could hide such horrors, then who could truly be trusted? The trial set new legal precedents for the use of circumstantial evidence, for protecting witnesses, and for breaking the code of silence that once shielded families from justice. Mercy Harden's testimony proved that blood ties could be overcome, and that the truth could still win, even the most twisted of cases. In 1801, the court sealed the surviving records, restricting access to law enforcement and scholars. The goal was twofold: to protect the privacy of victims' families, and to keep would-be imitators from turning the Harden's methods into a blueprint for murder. For almost 2 centuries, the full truth stayed hidden, fading into half-remembered local legends about bad folks who once lived near Beaver Creek. The exact location of the farm was eventually lost as new settlers arrived, and by the mid-1800s, only a handful of old residents could point to where the homestead once stood. That changed in 1987, when the files were rediscovered and historians could finally reconstruct the chilling truth. Yet even today, many questions remain. The caves beneath the old farm have never been fully explored. Some investigators believe there are still remains and evidence sealed deep within those limestone passages, waiting to be found. Perhaps most unsettling, the Harden case has forced historians to look again at other disappearances from the same era. Patterns of vanishing travelers have been found near other wealthy, pious frontier families in Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. No evidence has ever confirmed copycat killers, but the similarities are enough to raise suspicion. Did Ezekiel Harden take his darkest secrets to the grave? Or could there be more, other families, other farms, still hidden in history? One thing is certain: the Hardens remind us that evil rarely comes with a warning. It hides behind kindness, faith, and respectability, waiting until no one is watching. What do you think? Do you believe the whole truth was revealed, or are there darker secrets still buried beneath the Kentucky soil? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Share this with someone who loves dark history. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and hit the notification bell. There are many more mysteries waiting to be told.